Well, thank you everyone for coming to the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Seminar Series, our first one of the year. I just want to introduce Dr. Kurt Mackes. He has a dual role as a Senior Research Assistant for the Colorado State Forest Service and is also an Associate Professor here in this department. He got his Bachelor's and Master's of Science in Wood Science and Technology at CSU and then moved on to Virginia Tech for his PhD in Forestry and Forest Products. He's currently working on a number of research projects as well as extension work, particularly in wood utilization in Colorado. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Well, the topic I'm going to address today is utilizing ash trees killed by emerald ash borer here in Colorado. And generally, I will be following this outline, the table of contents. I'll talk a little bit briefly about the introduction and life cycle of EAB because it's pertinent to the utilization efforts underway. We'll talk about the EAB impacts nationally briefly as well. The current situation in Colorado. I'd like to touch on why utilization of trees killed by EAB is important, followed by utilization efforts along the Colorado Front Range, and ultimately the utilization challenges. I could probably spend the whole day talking about the challenges, but we'll save that for the end. So as far as the introduction, EAB, emerald ash borer, is non-native to the U.S. It's native to eastern Russia, northern China, Japan, and Korea. And if you look at it, it was detected in Michigan in 2002, but given the track that emerald ash borer takes in developing into an epidemic, it most likely was introduced in the early 1990s. As far as how it progresses within a tree, impacted trees lose 30 to 50% of their crown in 2 years and will generally die within 3 to 4 years. Now, based on some observations here in Colorado, that might be a little long for how fast it occurs here. It may occur perhaps in 2 to 3 years here in Colorado, just anecdotally based on observations of trees that have been impacted. If we look at the life cycle, emerald ash borer are small, bright, metallic green beetles. There's a picture of one on the board. The larvae feed on the inner bark of ash trees, so it's typical of bark beetles. The life cycle is between 1 to 2 years, and adults normally exit in June or July. And interestingly enough, they may live outside of the tree for only a few weeks, which makes it rather difficult to detect these beetles at times. And a good example is here in Fort Collins. You can walk around and look at ash trees, and well, there's a lot of ash trees being attacked in Fort Collins. And there's a lot of different pests attacking them. So emerald ash borer could be here for a number of years before it's detected, is the point I'm trying to make. So it may be here now, but it hasn't been confirmed. As far as symptoms, you have crown dieback, epicormic branching, bark splits, and if you happen to notice a lot of woodpeckers feeding on the ash, quite likely they're being attacked by something, perhaps emerald ash borer. The signs are a little are pretty definitive when you can identify them. The first is the D-shaped emergence hole, and have a picture of it right here. If you happen to strip away the bark, which we have, S-shaped larval galleries are pretty common. And of course, if you detect larvae, which can be up to about 1.5 inches long, kind of cream color, so fairly large actually, or adult beetles, then you know you have emerald ash borer. As far as the impacts nationally, if you look at the red area on this map, these are areas at high risk of EAB attack, particularly, well, all the ashes are susceptible to some extent, but white ash, green ash, and black ash are all particularly susceptible to EAB. If you look at the Colorado Front Range, we have primarily green and white ash. Certainly, if you look at Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, there's a lot of black ash. And really, if you look at the national impact, most of the states that are heavily impacted, particularly the upper Midwest, have teams at this point set up to help manage the EAB outbreaks that have occurred in their area. At this point in Colorado, we're just starting to begin to set up to handle the outbreak. And of course, by scale, ours is, I thought we had a really big problem here, but compared to other states, maybe not as much. Not to diminish what's going on here. So if you look at the outbreak in Colorado, it was first detected in Boulder, September 2013. Actually, Kendra Nash, who is an alum of CSU Forest Management, did make the detection in Boulder. And it's now found throughout Boulder, including Longmont, but there has been a quarantine zone set up in the county. I think the sobering point is that even with that quarantine zone, the outbreak is expected to spread throughout the Colorado Front Range where ash trees are found. So I suspect that at some point it will be showing up here in Fort Collins, for example. A large number of ash trees are at risk. Talk a little bit about some of the numbers. 98,000 is the estimate for ash trees in Boulder, and 1.45 million ash trees for the greater Denver metro area. So again, relative to other states, maybe not quite the same scale of dealing with dead trees, but still plenty for us. So why should we be concerned? Given the numbers that I just gave you, that roughly works out to about 15% of the trees found in urban forests along the Front Range. But if you look at it in terms of crown cover for Fort Collins, a lot of the ash in this city are fairly large, and they represent perhaps as much as 30% of the crown cover. So if you're walking up some of the city streets here, a good example is Garfield, just across from campus. You'll find that a lot of the trees along those streets are ash trees. And basically, if emerald ash borer comes to this town, similar to Boulder, many of the streets will have to be replanted with street trees after the epidemic runs through the area. Also, I'd like to thank Michaela for the pictures. These are actually pictures from Boulder and actual tree removals that occurred last fall. So why is utilization of these trees important? Well, there's a number of reasons. If we look at the utilization of EAB trees, especially the main bole of the tree, we do reduce the amount of chipping or grinding, and as a result, the disposal costs that go along with dealing with those trees. And actually, these costs are not insignificant. In Boulder, it's a very expensive proposition to bring in a tub grinder and actually chip or mulch the trees and then remove them. Literally thousands of dollars. and at least part of this cost could probably be avoided. The other thing about utilization is it reduces the amount of volume woody biomass going into landfills. And if you look at woody biomass in landfills, as that material decays over time, it becomes a major source of methane gas, very potent greenhouse gas. So if we can reduce the volume going into the landfill, that's another positive benefit. Solid wood products sequester carbon, which is another positive feature. And perhaps last but not least, utilization can help owners deal with losing trees. And perhaps economically, but in many cases it's not a big economic benefit to the owner to utilize their trees, but it does help them deal with the loss. And I've talked to a number of property owners. This was also related to work we did on thousand cankers disease and black walnut that just felt that their trees were being put to good use, either for research or going into wood products. And in a way, it really does help them deal with the loss. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about utilization, which was the main focus of this presentation. The wood of white ash and green ash, at least according to Hoadley, who kind of wrote the book on identifying wood, are more or less indistinguishable. So if you have the two side by side, you'll have a hard time telling them apart. Both have heartwood color that ranges from light brown to grayish brown. The sapwood is almost a pure white. And specific gravity of white ash is 0.6. This is at a 12% moisture basis. And green ash has a specific gravity of 0.53. So if you compare them, the white ash is a little more dense and perhaps a little harder than the green ash. If you looked at them both practically and how they might behave in products, they both are relatively hard, ring porous hardwoods, and have good shock resistance. So if you go to a baseball game and they're using Louisville Sluggers, for example, there's a good chance that they were manufactured from ash. Okay, and if you're using a hammer, might be hickory, but it might also be ash as well. So those are different types of products that you might see made from ash because of its properties. If you look at the complete list of utilization options for ash, you can see that there's a wide range. And actually that first one is kind of interesting because we see a lot of that type of use for ash in this state because of the types of companies we have processing them. Most of our mills are fairly small that are using hardwoods, usually small band mills, wood misers, if you will. And they do a lot of custom products, many of which borderline on are artistic in their nature. Of course, lumber and timbers are good options as well. Railroad ties, veneer furniture, cabinetry, pallets, anything that would take advantage of the ashwood properties. And then a whole host of specialty products. For example, wooden bowls and other turn products as well. Engineered materials and components, we don't have a lot of infrastructure to do those types of products, but ash is certainly suitable for them. And then finally, biochar, which is of particular interest here, and I'll mention it again in just a few minutes. Then, of course, biomass products, which would include firewood, chips, and mulch and other residue products. So these are all options for ash. So I just want to mention lumber again. There have been a number of projects that have involved taking ash trees. One was done in Boulder. We've done a couple as well for both ash and other species. And generally, what's been demonstrated is that the ash is very suitable for lumber and for utilization in a variety of products. As far as the biochar, we are very fortunate. Biochar now is a company that is located just south of Berthoud. And basically, they have agreed to take some ash and use it in their process. And it's a batch process. They have these kilns. So they'll take the ash, put it into the kiln, and actually produce a biochar from it, and probably analyze it to see if it meets their criteria for the product they want to sell. My guess is it likely will, based on having looked at their supply of wood that they're using now. In addition to using beetle kill pine, they use a fair amount of hardwoods as well. And I suspect that they will find the ash to work well in their process also. So utilization challenges, and this is where I'll probably spend quite a bit of time. When we look at utilizing ash wood, there are a whole series of issues that we're going to have to overcome in order to do that. Not the least of which is dealing with quarantine zones, wood coming out of Boulder County, and treatment requirements for moving ash out of those zones. So if you look at the, especially during the flight season, it's very difficult to move the wood out of Boulder County. So if we don't have processing facilities in the county, for all intents and purposes, to utilize the ash is probably either going to have to wait, or somebody will have to move into the county to do it. I see that as a challenge. Finding a location and people willing to go in and do the work. Boulder County was able to bring in Ryan Baldwin, who runs a small mill north of Fort Collins, and actually process the wood that I showed you previously in that picture of lumber. And on a small scale, that seems to work okay. But when we really get into the height of the epidemic, there's a lot more questions about how bringing people in might work, if that's what has to be done. When we talk about treatment requirements for ash, similar to other beetle issues where they're attacking the inner bark of the tree, the wood is generally thought to be fairly safe once you remove the bark. So there are protocols developed by APHIS for doing that. And for example, if you want to market firewood from EAB infested trees, you will have to heat treat the firewood before you can move it. That's not to say that movement doesn't happen, because it does, but if you want to do it legally, you have to heat treat it. And for most reputable companies, they're just not willing to risk their business, so they do it. As far as the ownership of ash trees, if you look at it across the Front Range in Colorado, it's very fragmented. The cities have control of fairly sizable numbers of trees on public property, city land and parks. But the majority of the trees, a high percentage actually, are found on private land. And the question of whether those trees will be available, and also having any sort of inventory on how many of those trees they are, what size they are, any information related to what might be suitable uses for those trees is often lacking or incomplete. The cities have taken the step, most of the cities along the Front Range, of at least starting to inventory what ash trees they have on their property if they haven't done it already. So I see that as trying to determine what the supply is and what types of products will fit that resource is still a little uncertain, and because of that, it does present a challenge to utilization. The other thing, this is all going to happen at some point in the future. We can't really get an answer from the plant scientists or the entomologists when this epidemic will really start to ramp up. And at this point, the log supply is expected to increase dramatically, but at this point, it's still fairly small. So when we talk to plants, to sawmills about potentially milling logs, well, they say, okay, send us some and we'll mill them up. Well, sometimes they're available and sometimes they're not. So if we're looking at a stable supply that a mill can count on for producing ash lumber, say for the next 3 to 5 years or 10 years, at this point, it's just not there. Which brings up the next point, and I'll touch on these next two in a little more detail. If you look at the current processing capacity, what we have are a lot of small mills, wood misers. But when we start talking about millions, potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of trees, these mills just don't have that kind of capability. For example, some of the small mills might use 100 logs a month. And it will take a very long time and a very large number of them to deal with this problem. So we need to look at higher capacity mills. And a good example of a mill that might be more suitable for what we're trying to do is a mill run by Golden West Pine Mills down in the Black Forest. And the State Forest Service was very instrumental in helping the mill owner, Andy Hines, set that mill up. Now that mill would have a capability of producing probably a little slower than it processes pine, so somewhere around 1 million board feet a year. That's starting to get closer to the scale we need to deal with this problem. Although it would probably take several mills at that size to deal with it completely. And then finally, large quantities of ash, or markets for large quantities of ash, are uncertain. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But it suffices to say, if I have a photo here or a map which shows all of the wood processing facilities along the Front Range. It's even a little bit out of date. It's less than a year old, but companies go in and out of business so fast. There's a couple on here that are no longer around, and then a couple have been added. But it's still pretty good. It was done last spring. If you look at what we have here, if you really break it down, it's just a collection of small mills. We have a couple of good-sized residue companies, A1 Organics and Renewable Fiber, that can deal in larger quantities of mulch and biomass products. But if we're really looking at generating value from ash trees, we're probably looking at lumber and other higher value-added products like millwork, cabinetry, flooring, paneling, products like that. Our infrastructure is not really set up to do that. So in developing a comprehensive plan to deal with emerald ash borer, one of the things we're going to have to strive for is to get some investment into infrastructure to process higher volumes of wood. So how do you do that? Well, there is some market development potential for ash. If you look at it, markets currently exist for both primary and secondary value wood, added wood products. We looked at that whole list of different products you could make from ash wood. And really, if you look at the price of ash, wholesale, it runs $2 to $3 per board foot. On a retail level, that equates to about $4 to $6. And that's a little better than Front Range Ponderosa pine, which is easily less than $1, in some cases less than 50 cents a board foot. At the same time, there was a lot of interest in processing walnut from trees killed by thousand cankers disease. And if you look at the price of walnut, you can start to understand. By comparison to ash, walnut is roughly twice as valuable and has a wholesale value of $4 to $6 and a retail value of $6 to $9. So a mill processing walnut with a wood miser will come out better than a mill processing ash, just because of the value of the wood. There have been a small quantity of ash logs milled, small relative to what potentially will be available. And they've demonstrated that the markets currently exist for these smaller quantities of wood. They usually don't have any trouble selling the wood or finding a use for it. But the markets for large quantities of ash are far less certain. And I hosted Brian Brashaw from the Forest Products Lab in January, and we talked quite a bit. He has done a lot with ash in Minnesota and Wisconsin. He kind of wrote the book. In fact, if you go online, you can find the sizable publication that he put out on EAB, actually invasive species generally. And he basically believes that we can probably find a market for most of this wood, but that we will probably have to transport it to other parts of the country where they have more infrastructure. Now, as to whether we can compete, because there's a large amount of ash on the market right now, I think if you look at the issue nationally, we are not the only state dealing with this issue, and a number of states even on a much larger scale. So we will have to compete with them, and finding markets will probably continue to be a challenge throughout the duration of this outbreak. So we are doing marketing research at Cowood to develop a plan for marketing relatively large quantities. The grades will vary from low to high depending on the log quality. And I'm looking at it from the viewpoint that at least the lumber will be processed here in Colorado. What happens to it after it's processed into lumber will be determined by the markets. So just to kind of summarize and maybe put a little bit of a conclusion on this. Emerald ash borer, as I indicated, are killing trees in Boulder County, and the outbreak or epidemic is expected to spread. The utilization of ash trees that are killed by emerald ash borer will help reduce disposal costs and perhaps cut down on the methane that is being put into the air as these trees would decay. And there are many potential uses for ash. Lumber and biochar are perhaps the two most promising at this point. But as I indicated, there are still many, many challenges with both supply and market uncertainty that will hinder utilization, probably throughout the epidemic, but hopefully we'll overcome them at least enough to process a fair amount of ash. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. And I left a good amount of time for questions, so yes. Doug.
Couple of questions. First one, I work with ash, and you know it's small scale stuff. Would ash be suitable for either glue lam applications where you're making a 60-foot long beam out of it structurally? Could you put it in like a lumber core panel where they're starting to do some of the multi-story wooden construction buildings?
The short answer to your question is yes, but ash is a fairly hard wood, so as you increase in specific gravity hardness, it becomes harder to bond the wood. So for like a glue lam application, there might be other woods that would be more suitable, but that certainly doesn't mean it couldn't be done. You'll have to forgive me, what was the second one?
Oh, it was all the same. Lumber core panels.
Yeah, it would be the same thing. I suspect there was some talk of trying to use ash for cross-laminated timbers, which is the same concept, taking smaller pieces and making a bigger member out of them. I suspect we'll be looking at that as well. So, yeah, it's possible. It's just anything you do has to work in the marketplace. Other questions? Yes.
Is there a point where it becomes economically rational for the state to open its own mill and operate it and then sell the lumber back to private markets in order to recover some of the cost of removal?
There would be a lot of resistance to doing that. For example, a lot of the cities have ordinances which prevent them, the forestry department, from selling the trees to help offset costs. If the company that's buying the trees is going to mill them for a profit. So I think it's even more fundamental than that. The state, in a sense, did fund Andy Heinz to put that mill down in the Black Forest. We helped him put it there through a grant. At the same time, I think that would be the more likely way that we would assist private industry with gearing up to address these issues in the future. So if it makes sense at some point, this would be through a competitive grants process, that somebody were to come up with a really good idea and a way to put a mill into action to help with this problem and could compete with all the other applicants for a grant, I think it would be a good proposal. But I think that would be more likely than the state actually purchasing a mill and operating it. It's just not likely. But Kyla, are you aware of any cities that might be considering doing that?
Operating a mill?
Yeah.
Denver is the only one that I know. They have a portable mill that they
Right.
use in their mountain parks. And they've talked about, so they're one of the cities, like Kurt mentioned, that have had this issue of once they harvest a tree, because they ran into this with black walnut, it's considered property of the city, just like if we were to try to get rid of a desk that the city owned at some point, it would have to be auctioned. So they actually went back and forth with the city attorney, and they kind of got back around to if they classified the tree as debris or waste, they could actually now sell that tree or give that tree away. But they have talked about starting to mill their own lumber and branding it, which other cities have done, as Denver urban did. So that's something that they've talked about doing.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Ryan.
Kurt, have you explored whether, because we're ramping up to a peak at some point for this, and I know there's not a lot of lumber now or a lot of ash, is there a way to stage the trees that are coming down so that, is there anybody that would be interested, for example, in purchasing and removing the trees from private landowners and storing them until they have enough quantity to do something with all of them?
Well, as far as the tree removals, there's a lot of companies that are interested in doing that for a price. The storage is another matter. There are probably some that will store. We have started talking with Fort Collins, Greeley, and Loveland about potentially setting up a concentration yard where homeowners or arbor care companies could actually take their logs and then either the cities would contract with a mill owner or perhaps auction the logs. There's a number of ways it could be handled. I think probably the most likely method at this point would be contracting with a mill owner. The mill owner would actually come in and take the logs that meet their specs, and I suppose they would help with disposal of those that don't. And that would be one scenario that we've looked at for the Tri-County area. As far as Boulder has a yard where they take their logs, and I believe Denver does too. So some of that infrastructure already exists. And logs, particularly the black walnut, has been most of those are probably being utilized at this point. Ryan Baldwin gets all the logs from Fort Collins and Greeley, for example, black walnut, and will mill those. So I think it's a possibility to have yards set up where the logs will go. Yes?
So I'm guessing that it's preferable to develop the infrastructure here, because someone did the math, it's a better net return than shipping it all away. I'm curious, it seems like if you build up the infrastructure for processing all that ash, once there's no longer that supply of ash, that much capacity is going to go to waste. So first of all, is that true? And second of all, if so, is there other infrastructure that people consider, like biomass energy, things like that might not actually be able to be used for other things after the ash is all gone?
Okay, a couple thoughts there. One, I think the idea of trying to transport logs long distance is probably going to be difficult to do economically. Generally, a good example, if you could have access to a rail line, you theoretically could transport them quite a ways and have them processed in a facility, say in the Midwest. Getting access to the rail is a difficult thing to do. I've tried to do it for, in one instance, for beetle kill pine, and I just was never able to get the railroad to cooperate with the state Forest Service. As far as you'll have to forgive me, what was the second part of that?
You're talking about excess capacity.
Excess capacity.
Most of the ash is sort of
Oh, okay. Now I remember. Okay. Most of the mills that are operating along the Front Range are not focused on ash at this point. They're focused on urban species generally. So they would be willing to switch to other species or back to other species once the peak of the epidemic is hit and it starts to drop off. I suspect I would be surprised if we ever get to a point, at least while things are ramping up, that we have excess capacity. After that, I think they would have to shift to other species or simply move on to other types of work altogether. I think you're correct in that sense.
Kurt, can I make a point on that as well?
Pardon? Sure.
Can I make a point? Yeah. So one of the things that we're finding is that the problem already exists. This problem of having to dispose of all of this waste It's just that EAB has kind of brought it into the light. So Boulder, for instance, spends easily tens of thousands of dollars once or twice a year just to process and haul material away from their yard. And a lot of that is probably, I mean, I don't know if you would agree, but is probably merchantable, or a good deal of it is.
Yes.
But, you know, just like Kurt's saying, that you don't really have the folks that are kind of aware of that problem and are, you know, are kind of starting to work more with urban wood, which is what, you know, Kurt's working on. But the problem is already there. It's just right now it gets shipped and landfilled and hauled off to composting facilities.
Yeah, it was a while back. It was really at the start of the Thousand Cankers disease in walnut that Whitney Crenshaw from Plant Sciences stopped by my office. And you know, it's really, it seems like it's just one thing after the other. So I'm not sure what will follow emerald ash borer, but quite likely there will always be a fairly decent supply of urban wood being removed from the urban forest. And dealing with that will continue to be an issue even after emerald ash borer has come and gone. Well, it may never go, but once it's peaked and on the downside. Yes?
You had addressed very early on, if you want to move firewood, you have to heat treat it. Is that true for bowls as well? Like, does Brian go down to Boulder, pick up a load of logs and haul them back up into Larimer County, or does he take his sawmill?
He took the sawmill down there.
Okay. Could he bring logs from Boulder County to Larimer County?
This time of year you could, yeah.
Okay, so it's
The non-flight.
that flight.
Yeah.
What about cross state lines?
That would be more of an issue, I believe. Yeah. I would say this, with black walnut, for example, the safest thing that could be done is to make sure that you remove all the bark and most of the sapwood, if not all of it. And I think that would be the same for the ash. When I talk to mill owners, it's kind of a liability issue. You know, I'd say to them, working with, you know, for example, hardwood black walnut that's infested with Thousand Cankers disease is a really good way for them to stay in business. But at the same time, you have to be responsible, because if they trace another outbreak back to your company, then you've got big problems. So it is a bit of a liability issue.
Along that line, I remember a powder post beetle infestation in a load of ash
Yes.
that caused the removal and destruction of the entire warehouse of a couple $1 million worth of other species as well. Does emerald ash borer infestation and death make the ash more susceptible to any other kinds of infestations? Is it transferable like that, or?
I would say that it doesn't make it more susceptible. Wood, it being a biological material, is susceptible to bioorganisms generally. Some are more susceptible than others, but I don't think it'd be more susceptible or less susceptible because of the EAB. Now, if you're treating the wood to move it, it would probably be less susceptible once it's heat treated. Yes?
Are there any comparisons between the emissions from biochar facilities and emissions from a landfill? Do biochar facilities create?
Well, there are a lot of comparisons between biomass facilities generally and landfills. The thing you don't get from the biomass facilities, and I'll include biochar, are controlled. And if you go down to biochar now, they have very strict air emissions guidelines that they have to adhere to. The landfill, they do, but it's a lot more questionable as to whether, how do you keep methane from coming off of woody biomass as it decays? You can have collection systems, but it's a lot less certain. I would say if I had my choice from an air emission standpoint, go with the controlled environment all the time. So most biomass facilities, if you look at them in comparison to prescribed burning or wildfire, the emissions are far, far less, maybe an order of magnitude less in many cases. Yes?
So is the quality of the wood not really impacted by the emerald ash borer?
Not in the case of ash, no. If you look at like some epidemics in other species like chestnut, those borers go much deeper into the wood. But then you sell what's called wormy chestnut, and you get a premium for it. So, yeah, almost all of it at this point, chestnut that you see around, has wormholes in it. So, yeah. Yes?
So if people in anticipation of the EAB are either trying to decide whether or not to engage in some kind of pre-treatment that might prevent an infection if such thing exists, or just fell them before it happens, is this a third option? Hold out and see if you can maybe sell your poor ash trees instead of pay to have them removed?
Well, there are treatments. They tend to be fairly expensive, and you have to do them periodically. It's kind of like hooking your tree up to an IV. You know, you're pumping chemicals into them, and they're pretty harsh chemicals too. So it's certainly an option for people to keep some of their trees, but if for example, if you have a city that has a lot of trees, quite likely they're going to pick and choose which ones they keep. And I would kind of reverse that. I would look at the treatment as almost a third option to the removals and utilization. How do you feel about that?
I mean, this is all, but the message that the state response team has really been trying to get across to people is if you have a tree that's valuable, for any reason, planting it behind your child's birth or something, you know, as long as it's in good condition, treatment is a good option. The insecticides that are used can be very effective, but not every tree is worth treating. And you know, a lot of the trees, like Dr. Mackes was saying, are hit by so many other things here that they just aren't. They're not going to take treatment very well. But I think some of the issues with waiting are, we're seeing this in Boulder right now, is that trees become very unsound very quickly. And so for a homeowner to have a tree removed from the backyard, for instance, is thousands of dollars for a claim of people because somebody won't climb that tree after, I think in the Midwest they say after 2/3 of the crown is gone. And most tree care companies have, you know, a limit that is lower than that, so you know, half the crown or 1/3 of the crown is gone because it's not safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the take-home message is if you're going to treat, do it right up front. Don't wait.
Yeah, there isn't a prophylactic treatment in stuff. There isn't a treatment that will prevent the insect from getting into the tree, but certainly if the treatment is there, then the insect thrives and compounds that insecticide as it enters the tree first. That's when they take care of that.
Yeah, I just, parents in law 4 huge green ash trees. They don't know what to do. They don't want to shell it out, just get rid of them. They don't have to, so they're kind of looking for options.
Yeah, one thing, the tree treatments are indefinite, really. I mean, that's what, when we talk to the entomologists, it's,
Yeah.
you know, at some point you'll have a peak for EAB and then the population will decline, but because we're talking about a non-native with no natural enemies, at some point, if you stop treating your ash, there will be some beetles that would come to the tree and ultimately would kill the tree. But an interesting thing, this is non-scientific, but you know, we're hearing that in areas where the trees have been treated, because the adults feed on the foliage, if you have a percentage of trees treated in an area, the beetles feeding on the foliage will die, and so you kind of put the population in check. So I would suspect that even if you treated out all 4 of the trees, and one of the trees, for example, and rotated it, you would at least maybe have some sort of positive impact. But that's hard to say, and it's not really supported by real science.
And well, it kind of is, so on a larger scale, so Deb McCullough, who was kind of the like EAB guru out of Michigan State, did a study, and she showed that if you treat a quarter of your population citywide, that you get better control than you do if you just kind of treat like a neighborhood or a highly infested area. And so many cities are taking that approach where, like Denver is kind of cool because they worked with a researcher at DU to come up with kind of like an algorithm to randomize their treatments. So they don't have, one area that's getting all the treatments. Boulder did start in the most heavily infested area, but they're treating a quarter of their population, and they kind of move out kind of from the center of the city in like a bullseye, and then treating every 3 years. So they get better control by randomly treating kind of across the city than by focusing on one area.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so it sounds like there is science, but it's at a larger scale.
Yeah, I don't know about it.
Yeah.
Talking about a smaller plot.
Thank you all.
I guess we're
Any
done.
more questions for Kurt? Let's give him another thank you.
Thank you.